Welcome to the Deep Dive, the only place where we take the hardest, most fundamental questions the universe can throw at us and distill them down into essential, usable knowledge.
And today, we are starting at the very, very core of your reality. I mean, forget the stars, forget quantum mechanics for a second, forget all of history.
Right.
We begin with the one thing you absolutely cannot doubt. The simple, undeniable fact that right now, there is something it is like to be you.
That's the perfect starting point
Right.
because that subjective inner what it is likeness, that is the whole game. That is consciousness, the subject of our deep dive today.
And it is arguably the biggest intellectual mystery left.
We have some incredibly deep, dense sources in front of us today. We've got philosophical treatises, cutting-edge neuroscience, even some sweeping cosmological views. All of them are trying to define and maybe, just maybe, explain this inner light.
So our mission is to navigate these different approaches. We're asking, what exactly is consciousness? Is it some final irreducible mystery? Or is it something that will eventually, just yield to scientific explanation?
And for you, the learner, this is crucial because the answer influences everything. It changes our scientific worldview, our ethical duties to animals, and how we might design artificial intelligence in the future.
It really does touch everything.
Okay, so let's start by unpacking this core concept because the word consciousness, I mean, it's notoriously slippery. It gets used in so many different ways.
It does. People use it in dinner conversations, in hospitals, in philosophy classes, and it can mean three completely different things. So to really get into the sources, we have to nail down these distinctions right away.
That structural clarity is so important.
It is. So at its most basic level, consciousness just means subjective experience.
The inner point of view.
Exactly, but philosophers find it necessary to break that down. And the first distinction, and honestly the one that gives science the most trouble, is phenomenal consciousness.
Phenomenal consciousness. This is all about qualia, right?
Yeah.
The raw, qualitative feel of an experience. It's non-transferable. It's just yours.
Yes, think about the specific experience of biting into a really ripe lemon. You have all the objective physical facts, the acid hitting your taste receptors, neural signals traveling up to your brain.
The science part.
Right, the science part. But the qualia is that intense, specific pucker you feel, the unique, sharp flavor that is undeniably and only accessible to you, the one having the experience.
It's the intrinsic felt quality, like the specific redness of red or the dull throb of a headache.
Precisely. This is the sensory, the feeling aspect, and it's what gives philosophers and scientists such a hard time. It's not about the mechanism that signals pain, it's about the actual feeling of suffering that follows the signal.
Okay, so that's phenomenal. The raw feel. What's the second type?
The second type is access consciousness, and this is much less about the feeling and much more about function, about the utility of information inside the mind.
Okay, so how does access differ from the raw feel of the lemon?
Access consciousness is all about information that is readily available to the rest of your mind for things like decision-making, reasoning, and speech. So if you see that lemon,
Right.
phenomenal consciousness is the sour taste qualia, but access consciousness is the information that tells your cognitive systems, okay, this is a lemon, it is sour, maybe don't eat the whole thing at once, which allows you to, grab it, describe it, or use it in a recipe.
I see. So a computer system, in theory, could have a really high degree of access consciousness. It could use and process information internally, report on it,
But without necessarily having any phenomenal consciousness.
without any inner feeling.
That's the distinction, exactly. And it is absolutely foundational for the AI debate we're going to get into later. Access consciousness is the functional, utilitarian part of the mind that deals with information flow and output.
And the third one is self-consciousness.
Right. And this sort of represents the apex of organization. Self-consciousness is the awareness of the self as a persistent subject in the world.
It's that reflective step, the recognition that I am the one who is seeing this, who is thinking this, who is making this choice.
Yes. It includes things like your biographical memory, your sense of personal identity over time, and just the awareness of your own mental states.
So to recap, phenomenal is the raw feeling, access is the information that's available for you to use, and self-consciousness is the I that kind of knits it all together.
And the sources are very clear on this. While different theories might focus on one or the other, the real debate, the one that really ignites everything, is around that phenomenal core, the simple, brute existence of that irreducible inner point of view.
That clarity is great because it lets us confront the primary challenge, which was so brilliantly framed by the philosopher David Chalmers, the difference between the easy problems and the hard problem.
It's a critical conceptual tool, and when Chalmers introduced the term easy problems, we have to remember he was being a bit ironic.
Right, they're not actually easy.
Not at all. These are monumental scientific and engineering challenges. They are easier only in the sense that they fit, neatly within our standard scientific framework of physical reduction. We can at least conceive of the kind of mechanism that would solve them.
So what are some of these mechanism-based problems that neuroscientists are working on right now?
They all involve mapping functions to physical processes in the brain. For instance, the binding problem.
Which is what, exactly?
It's the question of how the brain takes all these separate sensory inputs, the color from one area, the shape from another, the motion from another, and combines them into one single unified perception of, say, a moving red car.
So it's a puzzle of neural synchronization.
Exactly. Another one is the problem of attention and reporting. How do we focus our awareness on one specific input, your voice, for example, while filtering out the chaos of all the other sounds in the room?
And these are problems that, even if they're incredibly complex, we can imagine solving by saying something like, when these specific neurons fire in this specific sequence, information gets integrated at this particular hub in the brain. We're still in that objective third-person world.
Absolutely. We are mapping input-output functions. We're building models that can predict behavior and information integration. The belief is that with enough computational power and a detailed map of all the brain's connectivity, the connectome, we will one day explain how the visual cortex processes red light and how that signal then flows into the motor cortex to make you press a button.
But then we arrive at the dividing line, the chasm that seems to resist this kind of functional explanation, the hard problem of consciousness.
And the hard problem is so simple to state, but just devastating in its implications.
It is.
Why does the doing feel like something?
Why isn't it all just happening in the dark?
Precisely. We can explain the complete mechanism for processing the color red, every last neuron, but we can't explain why that mechanism is accompanied by the phenomenal subjective experience of redness rather than just running silently like a computer program.
This is where that famous thought experiment of the philosophical zombie becomes so powerful. It's such a stark illustration of the hard problem's core difficulty.
It really is. So imagine we've achieved it. We have a perfect explanation for all the easy problems. We know exactly how brain X takes an input and produces an output Y.
We have the complete instruction manual for the human machine.
The complete manual. Now, the zombie is a perfect physical twin of you atom for atom, cell for cell. It behaves exactly like you, it talks like you, it cries at sad movies like you. But inside, there is zero subjective experience.
Lights out.
Total darkness. It's just a complex, unconscious machine. And the hard problem asks, why are we not zombies? Why did physics or evolution decide to accompany all this objective physical processing with a subjective inner world?
And we have to be really precise here because our sources distinguish between the hard problem and what's called the explanatory gap. Are those two terms interchangeable?
No, they're not, and this is where a lot of discussions get muddy. The hard problem is really a metaphysical question. It's a claim that consciousness is a fundamental, irreducible property of reality that our objective science just can't seem to account for.
Okay, so it's a claim about what reality is.
Right. The explanatory gap, on the other hand, is an epistemological problem. It's about our knowledge. It describes our current failure to find a conceptual link between physical data and subjective experience.
So the gap is the difficulty we're facing right now, while the hard problem is the claim that this difficulty is actually proof that our physicalist worldview is incomplete.
Exactly right. Physicalists are generally optimistic about the gap. They argue it's temporary, it's just a limitation of our current scientific language, or maybe even a limitation of the human brain's ability to grasp this kind of complexity.
They believe a future, more powerful scientific theory, maybe involving new concepts in physics or information theory, will make that link between brain activity and experience totally transparent. The gap will close.
That's the hope. But the skeptics, the dualists, and the non-reductive physicalists, they see the gap as permanent. They argue that the very nature of scientific explanation, which is always third-person and objective, is inherently incapable of capturing a reality that is first-person and subjective.
It's like trying to describe the taste of a lemon using only equations about molecular structure and neural firings. You can describe it perfectly from the outside.
But you've completely missed the essential reality of the sourness. The explanatory gap suggests that this inability to translate isn't due to a lack of information, but a fundamental mismatch between the descriptive tools we're using and the thing we're trying to describe.
And this difference between a temporary difficulty, the gap, and an irreducible mystery, the hard problem, really defines the battle lines in this whole field.
It absolutely does.
It sets the stakes incredibly high. If the gap is permanent, then science, as we currently define it, has a fundamental blind spot regarding the most immediate and undeniable fact of our own existence. That confrontation leads us directly into the first, and I think it's fair to say, most widely accepted worldview trying to solve this: physicalism.
Right. This approach is rooted in the just overwhelming success of neuroscience. It maintains that consciousness is entirely a natural phenomenon that arises from the physical brain.
The core physicalist thesis is one of really a radical commitment. There's only the physical. Consciousness isn't something extra. It's an emergent feature or a product of the specific physical organization of the brain.
They argue that conscious states are identical to specific brain states. They're not just correlated with them, they are them, just experienced from the inside.
And their optimism really hinges on that correlation. We can reliably map subjective reports to neural activity. We know that feeling pain requires C fiber activation, that visual experience requires the visual cortex. Their bet is that as this mapping gets more and more detailed, the mystery of the feeling will just dissolve.
Precisely. They believe the hard problem is just a conceptual illusion, really, born out of our primitive understanding of complex information processing. So the goal for them is to develop highly detailed, predictive, and functional models of consciousness.
And the sources lay out three major contenders in the physicalist camp, trying to provide that functional bridge. Let's start with global workspace theories, or GWT. This one seems to be the most intuitively functional model.
GWT sees the brain as this massive parallel processing machine. I mean, think
Yeah.
of thousands of specialized unconscious processors. One is handling color detection, another motor control, another short-term memory, and they're all working at the same time, but independently.
Okay, so if everything is happening unconsciously and in parallel, where does consciousness actually step in?
Consciousness, in this model, is the act of taking certain high-priority information and putting it into a centralized, widely accessible global workspace.
You can almost visualize it like a theatrical stage.
Or a central broadcast tower, yeah. When a piece of information, let's say a sudden loud noise, is deemed important enough, it gets broadcast onto the stage, and that makes it globally available to all the other specialized unconscious subsystems.
So consciousness is functionally defined as the wide distribution of information for high-level coordination. It serves a really crucial utility. It allows the whole system to rapidly integrate diverse inputs for novel, non-routine decision-making.
That's its function, exactly.
Yeah.
In GWT, you are conscious of something if and only if that piece of information has successfully entered and been broadcast from the workspace.
And this explains a lot clinically. Like why damage to the areas responsible for coordinating this global broadcast, often in the prefrontal cortex, can dramatically impair general awareness, even while local functions like basic visual processing might remain intact.
It does. But the inevitable physicalist challenge comes right back.
Why does that broadcast feel like something? We can build a silicon system, an AI, that broadcasts information globally to all its subsystems. But does that system necessarily have qualia? Is there anything it's like to be that computer?
And that's the classic critique GWT faces. It explains access consciousness brilliantly. It shows us how information becomes useful and available. But it doesn't solve the problem of phenomenal consciousness.
The subjective light.
Why is there a subjective light accompanying that global signal? Now, the GWT advocate will usually respond by saying the subjective light is the informational structure itself, when it's experienced from the inside. But for many, that answer just feels like a restatement of the problem, not a solution to it.
Okay, so let's move on to the second major theory, which tries to be a lot more rigorous and mathematical. Integrated information theory, or IIT.
Yes, IIT is arguably the most ambitious theory in the field today.
Developed primarily by Giulio Tononi.
And his colleagues, yes. It takes a radically different approach. It doesn't ask what consciousness does functionally. It asks what properties conscious systems have. And its central, bold claim is that consciousness is integrated information.
What does that actually mean in practical terms? How do they quantify integrated information?
Well, they attempt to quantify it using a mathematical concept they call DIFI.
Right.
And IOC is a measure of a system's capacity to integrate information. More specifically, it measures the cause-effect repertoire of the system, the degree to which the whole system is irreducible to its parts.
I'm going to need more detail on that irreducibility. That sounds dense.
It is, but think of it this way. Consider the entire brain. If you were to break it into two halves, the causal connections, the way the left half affects the right and vice versa, are drastically reduced compared to when it's an intact whole. If the A value is high, it means the system has incredibly strong internal connectivity. And knowing the state of all the individual parts still doesn't tell you everything about the behavior of the whole. It's more than the sum of its parts. If A is 0, the system is just a collection of independent elements, like a pile of rocks.
So consciousness is a high A value. It's the result of a system being both highly unified and highly complex at the same time.
That's the core idea.
And this implies that consciousness isn't exclusive to biological brains.
Exactly. That's one of the most radical predictions of IIT. It predicts that entities with high structural integration, like our cerebral cortex, will be highly conscious. But conversely, it suggests that structures that process massive amounts of information but are functionally segregated, like the cerebellum, which actually has more neurons than the rest of the brain combined.
Right, the cerebellum is huge.
It might have a very low value and thus be largely unconscious, and this aligns perfectly with clinical observations. People with cerebellar damage don't report a loss of consciousness.
That is a stunning insight. It turns the attention away from what you're made of and toward how you're put together.
It's a structural theory.
So if the internet or a massive quantum computer were to achieve a high enough axion, this theory suggests we would have to attribute some level of consciousness to it.
That is the consequence. The theory rests on 5 core axioms that describe the essential properties of experience, that it exists, it's structured, it's specific, it's unified, and it excludes other possibilities. The power is that if the math of these accurately captures those axioms, then we have a theory that should apply universally.
What's the downside?
The challenge is computational. Calculating the eye of the human brain is currently impossible. It's just too complex. And even more, IIT still struggles to bridge that final gap. It shows us where consciousness should be, but it doesn't explain why that specific configuration of integrated information should feel like the color red, as opposed to just being a very complex calculation running in the dark.
It still bunks up against the hard problem. And finally, let's look at the third perspective, the higher order theories, or Hati. This shifts the focus from global access to a kind of internal monitoring.
Right. Higher order theories suggest that consciousness is dependent on self-monitoring. So a first-order state is just the raw sensory input, the firing pattern in your brain that corresponds to red.
But that state is unconscious.
It's unconscious in this view until you have a second or higher order mental state that is directed at the first state.
The internal spotlight. So I'm not just seeing red, I'm implicitly or explicitly aware that I am seeing red.
Precisely. If that second-order representation, that thought or perception about the first-order state is absent, the information is processed unconsciously. For instance, sometimes you realize the clock has been ticking for hours, but you weren't aware of it until your attention was just drawn to it. The physical input was always there.
But the second-order monitoring state was not. This makes a lot of intuitive sense for self-consciousness and access consciousness. It explains how we can be aware of our own mental states. But how does it handle the phenomenal qualia, the redness itself?
And that is the persistent weak point. HRT proponents argue that the higher order state is what creates the phenomenal quality. But critics just argue this pushes the problem back one level.
Right. Why is the higher order state itself conscious? Why doesn't that second order monitoring process just run silently too?
It seems to lead to an infinite regress. If seeing red needs an awareness of red, why doesn't the awareness of red need an awareness of the awareness of red, and so on, forever?
That's the trap. It's clear the strength of physicalism is its direct connection to neuroscience, its functional utility. It explains how the brain works and where consciousness correlates with activity.
But despite all their sophistication, all 3 of these major theories, GWT, IIT, and HT, ultimately fall silent when you press them on the hard problem. They show us the perfect dark machine, but they cannot derive the luminous feeling from the objective mechanics.
And that conceptual failure is what drives so many philosophers and scientists away from pure physicalism and toward some stranger ideas.
So if physicalism, which is really the reigning scientific model, fundamentally fails to account for that subjective feel, we're forced to look beyond matter.
And this takes us into the realm of non-physical views, starting with the big one, dualism, which is historically the dominant spiritual and philosophical approach.
Dualism is a simple, very powerful claim that consciousness cannot be fully reduced to physical processes. It says there are two fundamental kinds of stuff in the universe: the physical matter, energy, and the non-physical mind, or soul. The mental component is irreducible.
This tradition goes all the way back to Descartes, who argued for what's called substance dualism, that the mind and the body are two entirely separate interacting substances.
For a modern dualist, the phenomenal experience of, say, a slow, throbbing pain is correlated with C fiber firing in your nerves, but it's a mental event, fundamentally distinct from the objective, physical firing of the nerve itself.
That distinction is the key. And the most compelling support for dualism really comes from these thought experiments that try to demonstrate the insufficiency of physical facts alone.
We already touched on the philosophical zombie, but let's revisit it, because the physicalist has a strong counter-argument.
So, the dualist premise is, if we can coherently imagine a physically identical zombie without any consciousness, then consciousness must be something extra, a non-physical property that's added on top of the physical facts.
Right. But the physicalist fights back hard on this. They argue that just because you can conceive of a zombie world doesn't mean a zombie world is actually possible.
They say our imagination is just failing us.
Exactly. They say our ability to imagine it is a failure of our current language and concepts. Once we fully grasp the complex physical laws that govern the brain, the relationship between brain states and conscious states will be seen as necessary. Consciousness will logically pop out of the physical facts, and that will make the zombie world an impossibility.
So the whole zombie thought experiment is basically a battle of intuition versus necessity. The dualist says, look, I can imagine the dark machine, so the light must be separate. And the physicalist says, your imagination is misleading you. The light is the machine once you fully understand it.
That's the debate in a nutshell. And that leads us to the second, and perhaps even more devastating, thought experiment against physicalism, the knowledge argument, featuring Mary, the color scientist.
Right, Mary, the brilliant scientist who knows every single physical fact about color vision, but she spent her whole life in a black and white room and has never actually seen color. Let's dive deeper into what happens when she finally steps out.
So Mary knows everything there is to know about retinal processing, neural pathways, opponent processes, the wavelength of light. She has every measurable, objective, third-person fact about what happens in a human brain when it sees red.
She has the complete physical story.
The complete story. Yet, when she steps out of that room and sees a red rose for the first time, the sources assert that she gains genuine new knowledge.
She learns something new.
She learns what red looks like.
And the implication of that is just massive. It means that phenomenal experience, that subjective feel, is a piece of knowledge that resists purely physical description. It's a fact about our reality, but it's not a physical fact.
It proves, or so the argument goes, that the physical facts, however complete, do not constitute the whole story. The subjective quality, the qualia, is something new that you can't infer from the objective data alone. For the dualist, this is strong evidence that qualia are irreducible mental properties. The redness we experience is a genuine, non-physical feature of the world.
The power of dualism is definitely its intuitive grasp of our inner life. It accommodates non-material ideas like a soul or persistent personal identity, but it comes with a huge conceptual anchor, one that Descartes himself wrestled with, the interaction problem.
This is the dualist's Achilles heel. If the mind is non-physical, where is it located? And how on earth can it cause physical changes in the brain and vice versa? If I decide, non-physically, to lift my arm, how does that non-physical decision trigger physical synapses in my brain to fire?
And even more critically for modern science, doesn't this violate fundamental laws of physics, like the conservation of energy and the causal closure of the physical world?
It seems to. If a non-physical mind adds energy to the physical brain to initiate an action, that violates the principle that physical events are only caused by prior physical events. It implies energy is being created from nothing.
And this difficulty, this mind-body causal link, has led most mainstream scientists to reject what's called substance dualism.
Right. They prefer a less radical position, if they go this way at all, called property dualism. It holds that the brain just has two kinds of properties: physical properties and non-physical emergent mental properties. But even property dualism struggles to explain how that emergent mental property, the feeling, can exert any causal influence back on the physical base that created it.
Okay, so let's pivot completely to a third way, one that tries to sidestep both the interaction problem and the creation problem at the same time. panpsychism.
It's a view that sounds almost mystical, but it's gaining surprising traction among modern neuroscientists and philosophers who are frustrated by the limits of physicalism.
Panpsychism is so radical in its basic assumption. It argues that consciousness, or at least a primitive form of proto-experience, is a basic fundamental feature of reality.
Just like mass or charge or space-time, it's not something that suddenly emerges at a high level of complexity in a brain. It was built in all along from the very beginning.
So the motivation is to avoid that creation problem.
Mm.
We don't have to explain how a dead, unconscious hunk of matter suddenly becomes luminous and self-aware.
Because it was never truly dead or unconscious to begin with. It always had some tiny rudimentary inner aspect.
And our complex human consciousness is just a highly organized, very complex structure of these pre-existing fundamental proto-experiences.
That's the key elegance of the view. We're not saying that a rock is worried about its taxes or that an electron feels lonely. We're saying that the underlying physics, the fields, the fundamental particles, possess some inherent basic characteristic that, when organized in the immensely complex structure of a brain, results in your unified, rich, subjective experience.
But if everything has a micro-experience, panpsychism immediately runs into its own primary conceptual hurdle, the combination problem.
The combination problem is devastating for panpsychism. If trillions of fundamental particles each have a tiny, individual flicker of experience, how do those tiny, scattered elements combine or merge into the single, unified, complex experience of a human being?
Right. My visual field is one unified experience of color and depth and motion. It's not trillions of tiny, separate little subjectivities all existing side by side.
And this isn't just about addition, is it? One micro-experience plus another micro-experience should just equal two micro-experiences. How do they fuse into a single macro-subject? It's like arguing that if you just take enough individual water molecules, you eventually get the subjective experience of wetness, which that makes no sense.
It doesn't.
The problem requires a deep explanation of how subjectivities merge, and that's something we have no conceptual framework for at all.
Just to round out the alternatives, let's briefly touch on two other views that seek a kind of fundamental unity. First, neutral monism.
Neutral monism, often associated with figures like William James, posits that there is a single, deeper, fundamental reality that is neither strictly mental nor strictly physical.
It's neutral.
It's neutral. Mind and matter are two sides of the same coin, just two different ways of perceiving this underlying neutral stuff. When you view it externally from the outside, it appears as physical matter. When you experience it internally from the inside, it appears as mind.
And finally, the most radical departure of all, idealism.
Idealism just flips the whole materialist script on its head. Instead of matter giving rise to mind, idealism asserts that reality is fundamentally mental or experiential. Consciousness is the starting point.
So in this view, matter is just a pattern or a structure within a universal consciousness. Your brain isn't producing your consciousness is producing your experience of your brain.
It is the most challenging view for the scientific method to incorporate because it asserts the absolute priority of the subjective over the objective.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time defining the hard problem and exploring these major attempts to solve it. But now we have to step back and address the fundamental constraint that makes this entire debate so difficult in the first place.
And that's the explanatory gap and this crucial difference between the first-person and third-person perspectives.
Right. This is where we confront the limitations that are just built into our methods of inquiry.
Science, by its very nature, is a third-person endeavor. It has to be. It relies on objectivity, public observability, measurement, and the mathematical description of systems from the outside.
But consciousness is inherently, absolutely first person. It is the private, subjective reality of what it is like inside. And the moment you try to communicate that reality, the sourness of the lemon, the feeling of love, you have to translate it into third-person language and objective descriptions.
And this is exactly where the explanatory gap is said to reside. The philosophical claim is that no amount of purely third-person description, no detail on neural connections, no equation of integrated information will ever fully capture the first-person reality of qualia.
It's a category error.
It's a category error. We are trying to describe a subjective experience using tools that were designed only for objective reality.
So even if we had a perfect map of the brain, and we could point to a specific neural firing pattern and say, that right there, that is the feeling of sadness, we still haven't explained why that firing pattern feels sad. The description just remains incomplete.
Correct. We have a perfect correlation, but we lack the conceptual framework to bridge the description of thatter, the neurons, and the description of the experience, the sadness.
The optimist, who is usually the physicalist, believes this difficulty is just semantic, that a more powerful future model will make the link intuitively obvious and the gap will just dissolve.
While the pessimist believes the gap reveals a permanent, fundamental barrier between objective language and subjective reality.
But regardless of whether the gap is permanent or temporary, our choice of theory about consciousness has these profound, immediate, and practical implications for ethics and for technology. We have to look at where we draw our moral boundaries.
Starting with animals, if we accept phenomenal consciousness, the capacity to feel, as the moral dividing line, then our definition of consciousness instantly dictates our treatment of the entire non-human world.
And yeah, the sources are really clear on this.
Yeah.
The evidence overwhelmingly suggests that phenomenal consciousness is widespread across the animal kingdom. We're not just talking about mammals.
No, we're talking about octopuses, fish, maybe even insects, all exhibiting behaviors that strongly indicate a capacity to feel pain, fear, and even joy.
And that capacity to feel is the crucial factor. If a fish has the capacity for phenomenal pain or raw, subjective experience of suffering, then our practices in fishing, farming, and research have to shift.
You have to shift from viewing them as purely biological mechanisms to viewing them as beings deserving of moral consideration. The debate is no longer about maximizing utility. It's about minimizing suffering based on the existence of that inner light.
The second, and far more speculative implication, is in the development of artificial intelligence. I mean, we are rapidly approaching the ability to create systems that functionally mimic human intelligence. Could they actually be conscious?
The answer is entirely dependent on the theory you embrace. If you subscribe to physicalism, specifically a functionalist view like global workspace theory, then the answer is a resounding yes.
If consciousness is just a functional organization of information, then any system, regardless of what it's made of, silicon, biological, quantum.
If it achieves the right level of complexity and functional organization, it must be conscious.
So if an AI achieves a high enough OR, according to IIT, or if it successfully manages a global broadcast of information, a physicalist would have to argue it has some form of consciousness.
They would. The dualist, however, would hold the line. They would argue that consciousness requires either a special, irreducible, non-physical component, a soul that you can't code, or maybe an essential biological substrate that you can't replicate in non-organic materials.
So for the dualist, an advanced AI is just a super zombie.
Functionally perfect, but internally dark.
The stakes here are just immense. If we develop an advanced AI and we are physicalists, we might soon face the moral obligation to treat that system as a partner, or even a new class of person with rights. If we're dualists, we're just building powerful tools that will never be anything more than extremely sophisticated automatons.
The hard problem of consciousness is moving out of the philosophy department and into the realm of global policy, and it's happening fast.
It's so clear that the effort to solve the puzzle of consciousness is fundamentally an effort to solve the puzzle of ourselves. I mean, beyond the labs and the thought experiments, how we resolve this deep dive really informs how you, the listener, view your own existence.
It changes everything about your self-perception. If you adhere to the strong physicalist view, there's an incredible kind of beauty to your existence. You are a miraculous achievement of chemistry and evolution, a complex biological machine that has, against all odds, achieved self-awareness.
But if you embrace the non-reductive views like dualism or panpsychism, your existence takes on a profoundly different character. It suggests there's something non-local, irreducible, and maybe mysteriously luminous about your awareness that transcends your physical body.
This choice also dictates our view on mortality and the afterlife. If consciousness is an emergent product of the brain, then awareness ends absolutely when the brain ceases to function, a perspective that's called annihilationism.
But if there is an irreducible mental or spiritual dimension, then the possibility opens for some form of awareness to persist beyond the death of the physical body.
And we can't ignore the deep resonance this whole debate has in spiritual and contemplative practice. Many of these traditions don't treat consciousness as a mystery to be reduced, but as the fundamental, primary reality.
Right. Traditions like Buddhism or Vedanta often assert that phenomenal consciousness is the foundation of reality. It's the ultimate nature of the universe.
And for them, the deepest explanation doesn't come through intellectual formulas or anatomical dissection. It comes through transformed experience and realization. They seek to access pure awareness, treating the contents of your mind as secondary to the essential luminosity of consciousness itself.
And that brings us right back to the undeniable truth. Consciousness is the stage. It's the container, the ultimate reality in where all of life unfolds for you. All your joy, suffering, love, fear, and meaning, they exist only because they are felt within that subjective space.
So let's quickly summarize the three primary explanations we've covered and the challenges they leave us with.
First, we have the strong physicalist optimism. They maintain the hard problem is just a conceptual error, and that future neuroscience, maybe using math like Bay from IIT, will ultimately reduce subjective experience to objective physical processes.
And the challenge they still face is proving that a functional structure is the feeling.
Second, the dualist and non-reductive views. They use the zombie and Mary arguments to insist that qualia are irreducible mental properties. Science can map the correlations perfectly, but a fundamental non-physical dimension will always remain.
And their challenge is the interaction problem, explaining how a non-physical mind can cause physical action.
And third, the panpsychist, idealist, and monist views. These radical alternatives try to redefine the very nature of reality, arguing that mind or proto-experience is fundamental.
And the main challenge for panpsychism is that devastating combination problem. How do tiny bits of experience merge into a single unified subject?
So here we stand at the end of the deep dive, having mapped the outer limits of our understanding. We know where the feeling is, how it behaves, and where it correlates with matter. But that deep down question, why and how there is an inner light at all, remains arguably the single most profound mystery facing humanity.
And living with that mystery is the philosophical exercise itself. It forces a kind of humility and wonder. Whether you believe the answer lies in advanced physics, in mathematics, or in some irreducible non-physical layer, you are affirming the sheer complexity of existence.
The final provocative thought we want to leave you with from this deep dive is this. If the sheer existence of your phenomenal consciousness, the simple fact that there is a you experiencing this moment, is the most fundamental fact of your universe, then the deepest scientific or philosophical journey available might not be outward, into the atoms and the stars.
It might be inward. If consciousness is the light, what insights can you gain by turning that light upon itself and rigorously studying the nature of your own irreducible experience? That remains the ultimate frontier, accessible only to you.